Your unconscious value structures determine the direction and content of your perceptions. And so it's built right into the way you move your eyes, because you tend to look at things you value, right? Or at things you're afraid of. Like you look at things with valence, and part of the decision about what has value is dependent on the implicit structure of your moral system, because morality is about what's good and what isn't, and that's been partly a conscious construction of you, but it's partly something you've picked up by interacting with people like mad ever since you were born. You don't know all the rules any more than the damn cricket did. You just don't, and you can't, because you're too complicated. But you act them out, and then you also have representations of how people act in your imagination. Dreams are, that's what a dream is, that's what a fantasy is, that's what that little movie that plays inside your head when you remember what you did is, and you only remember the gist, you know. So even the imagistic representation of your behavior in your past, which is basically your episodic memory, it's already selecting and molding and turning it into a relatable story. It can't help but do that. It's the only way you can represent it. And so you don't know how you do that or why you do that, but part of it's governed by this implicit morality that's part of your procedural memory system, part of the way you act and part of the way you move your eyes and listen to things and focus on them. And that's all being instantiated inside of you because of this immense social, your biology, but also this immense social project that you're continually engaged in. And so that informs what you remember, it informs what you imagine, it informs what we collectively imagine, it informs what we can collectively understand. And partly what you're doing while you become conscious of yourself is to map the implicit structures that already constitute you from society into explicit representation. That's what self-understanding means. And you know, when you have that moment of insight about something you've done, it's like you're watching this repetitive behavior that you've manifested, probably that got you in trouble. You know, it's your characteristic way of falling accidentally into chaos, and you talk about it and your problems, you talk about them with your friends, you talk about them, and maybe you have dreams about them, and you're trying to relate them, and you have memories about them that you can't get rid of because they're negatively toned, and so you talk about them, and then someone comes up with a little statement that links them together causally, and you think, aha, that's what I'm doing. And then maybe you can stop doing it, or at least maybe then you can think up some strategies for not doing it anymore. But it's not like you know, it's like you're acting it out. You know it that way. But until the representation matches that pattern, that click of insight doesn't occur. And that's like a revelation. It's a really good way of thinking about it, because the knowledge is there in its implicit form, and all of a sudden, bang, it's been made explicit as a fantasy maybe, or also as a set of semantic statements. You know, maybe you have a crush on someone and you don't notice it, and maybe you find yourself having a fantasy about them. You think, oh, that means something, that indicates something. Maybe you don't want to know that that's what you want, but the fantasy will tell you. And one of the things Jung suggested, and this is sort of out of the Freudian tradition of free associations, is watch yourself, watch your fantasies, because they're always happening. And they'll tell you something. And so one of the things I do when I'm interacting with my clients is we'll have a discussion, and then their eyes will drift a little bit, and I'll know that something's flitted through their mind, you know, and that means we've touched on something that has a multiplicity of elements. And so I'll stop and say, look, I noticed that maybe you teared up. That's another thing to really watch. Or maybe you laughed, or you drifted at least. It's because some other thought has entered your field of consciousness. And then if you can get the person to grab those thoughts, to notice them, then you can often figure out the avenues along which that particular conversation might unfold. That's a complex. That's a Jungian complex or a psychoanalytic complex. It's like there's an emotional core that produces a whole range of associated ideas, and that thing's got a life. It's like a micro-personality, and it might have resentment in it, might have anger. It's often negative emotion tinged, because though negative emotion tinged episodes are still problems, and they will emerge automatically because your threat detection systems force them onto your consciousness, essentially. So you watch, and when you drift, you'll drift, and the fantasy is partly a representation of the problem space. You know that happens when you wake up at 3 in the morning and you're worried about things, right? Because actually what happens is you wake up during threat processing, and if you're depressed, actually that gets so intense you can't sleep. So then you just lay there all night worrying, not fun. And those are fantasies about the negative elements of your past, present, and future. And the fantasies can also breed solutions. And that's partly why Freud regarded dreams as wish fulfillments. It's partly, and he wasn't, that was where he stopped. It's not correct. It's partially correct. It's like the fantasy will provide you with a problem and a potential solution, but they're more like problem identification mechanisms, the fantasies, with the possibility of a solution built in. And so a way of thinking about that is that you can generate potential futures. So they're like each segregatable environments according to the rules of your fantasy. Then you can generate little avatars of yourself that inhabit each of those little universes, and you can run them as simulations. And then you can watch what happens in the simulation, and if it's a catastrophe, then you don't have to act it out. And that's exactly, not exactly, that's akin to what you're doing when you go watch a movie, except that is much more coherent and well thought through, you know, than just a dream, which is often quite fragmentary. And that's partly because the dream is willing to sacrifice coherence to play with category structures. You know, and that's why in dreams things can change from one thing into another really weirdly, or scenes can change from one scene into another without a logic. The logic gets loosened so that the expanse of your thinking can widen. And it's dangerous to do that, and that's partly why you do it when you're asleep and paralyzed. You know, you don't run around and act out your pseudopodal fantasies, you know, where you're stretching yourself out into the world. There's no risk exactly, and so, although it can be bad enough so you'll wake up in terror, you know, but that's better than being in a crocodile's mouth by a large margin. Anyways, back to these birds. These are used later in the movie as manifestations of the Holy Spirit, roughly speaking, and of course that's a standard Christian symbol, although, as I mentioned, the dove often represents the Holy Spirit, and we'll talk about that later. But this movie has very strong pagan elements in it, as I mentioned before, as opposed to strictly Christian symbolism. But that's a foreshadowing. And what it foreshadows is that, well, a new day has dawned. It's the emergence of new consciousness. And everything last night went well, really well. Everything in the, let's call it the unconscious, say, after time stops. That all went well, and so the new day is full of promise. And so the birds are singing and the sun is shining, and like, hooray. And so that's exactly, so that sets, this is the next scene, right? So it sets the tenor for that scene just like the introductory song does. So anyways, then you see all these kids playing and enthusiastic, so they're off to school, which is presented in a positive light, and so that's how, where you get socialized. So Pinocchio is ready to go beyond the boundaries of the familial home. And he's ready because his father prepared him and because his mother prepared him. And so he goes off, and he's not going off alone, he's going with his conscience, and which is sort of the you could think about it again as the internalized representation of nature and society. And so he's not going out there alone, even though he's not very good at it. And so he's pretty excited about this, and so is Geppetto. See, Geppetto isn't standing there paralyzed with terror, and the kid isn't phobic of the outside world. And so that's, he's treating it as an adventure. I mean, even though, well, it's an adventure, but adventures can be dangerous. What if the other, you can imagine a kid, especially one who's like high neuroticism, who hasn't been encouraged sufficiently to overcome that, let's say, their primary idea might be, well, what if the other kids don't like me? That's a big one. What if the teachers don't like me? What if the other kids won't play with me? It's like, yeah, what if? That's rough, man. And if you're not a playful kid, it could easily be the case. So, but that's not Pinocchio. He's like spinning out, ready to go. And so, good. He's got naive, but enthusiastic. Okay, well, that at least gets the ball rolling. Now, you've got these two evil creatures here, the fox and the cat. I think this one's based on one of the Marx brothers, actually, Harpo Marx, who I believe never said anything. But be that as it may, there are these ne'er-do-well characters, the fox in particular. Now, fox is a standard trickster animal, right? It's a classic animal, maybe because it's good at hiding and it's good at hunting. I don't know exactly why, but and coyotes are like that too. They're classic trickster animals. He's kind of like Wile E. Coyote, in fact, you know, the Warner Brothers character who's genius at large, and of course whose arrogance continually gets him walloped. And this character has a lot of features like that, but he feigns being an English gentleman of like the 1890s and pretends to be educated, and he has a kind of high blown way of talking, and he's a fraud through and through. And he's got this, you know, sidekick who is barely there at all, and he doesn't treat him that well, but he's got someone to lord it over, so that keeps his dominance hierarchy thing going well. And the fact that he's like a second-rate companion, well, he never really notices that, although he'll treat him contemptuously whenever he gets a chance.